Hopcraft, thank you so much for your question. Have we ever had a runaway on British railways? Well, the simple answer is yes. We've had lots. If you look throughout the railway's history, you'll see many occasions of trains running away for various reasons. Sometimes people are very lucky and aren't injured. Other times, people aren't so fortunate. I'm going to talk to you about one particular example that ended in the most horrific of circumstances. And to look at this, we have to go all the way back to the 12th of June 1889 to the Irish town of Armagh. The Armagh Methodist Sunday School had planned an excursion train that morning to take around 800 of its members and patrons from Armagh to Warrenpoint on the County Down coast. Dundalk was the nearest engine motive power depot, and from Dundalk had been sent driver Thomas McGrath with a 240 type steam engine and 15 coaches. Now, the original plan was for the train to use 13 of those 15 coaches. However, more passengers than planned had turned up that day, around 940. So the station master at Armagh had taken the decision that those final 2 coaches would be used after all. Driver McGrath, well, he wasn't happy about it. According to the inquiry, driver McGrath objected on the grounds that he felt the engine simply wasn't powerful enough to pull 15 carriages, fully loaded with passengers, up the steep inclines that existed on the 4 miles or so out of Armagh station. The general manager's chief clerk was riding on the train that day, and he'd suggested to driver McGrath that perhaps they could either rely on the next train to help push the excursion train up the bank, or they could leave some of the coaches behind and then have the next train take them up the bank and leave them at the next station. Neither of these options were particularly suitable for driver McGrath, and he refused all assistance. To this point, this all may seem straightforward, but there are some irregularities. Firstly, driver McGrath had never actually driven the train over the route on his own. He'd been over the route as a fireman, but not as a driver. The second thing is the braking system. Now, normally a braking system would have a fail-safe whereby if it loses its air pressure, the brakes will apply, and the system would need to create air pressure to push the brakes off the wheels. The braking system on this particular train worked in the opposite way. It worked through the creation of a vacuum, but it needed the vacuum to apply the brakes, and if the train lost the vacuum and vented the pipes to air, the brakes would release. And a third thing that I find an act of lunacy was that in order to prevent ticketless travel, the tickets of all 940 people were checked before the train departed. Now, that's not necessarily unusual in itself, it's a big task, but that's not the act of lunacy. As the guards checked all the tickets and completed the ticket check in each compartment, they locked the doors. Now, the train was so full that there were passengers travelling in each of the guards' vans. There was a guards' van at the very front behind the engine and a guards' van at the very rear. These housed a guard each, and they had a handbrake in them. Now, it's very unusual, almost unheard of, for passengers to travel in these vehicles, but there were so many people travelling to Warrenpoint that the guards had no alternative other than to let them into those vehicles. So it just seems absolutely crazy to think of these people being locked in to the vehicles. Once everything was ready, driver McGrath departed with the excursion train, and the train made a good attempt of getting up the bank, but it never really exceeded 10 miles an hour, and around 200 yards from the summit, the train came to a stand. Now, at this point, there wasn't really an issue when it comes to safety. The brakes were applied, but they were applied because the pipe that created the vacuum that applied the brakes was closed, and because it was closed, this enabled the vacuum to exist. So all the time the train's formation wasn't disturbed, the vacuum remained and the brakes stayed on. Now, the problem started when the chief clerk decided that he would direct the train crew to split the train and take the front portion over the summit of the bank and on to the next station, which was Hamilton's Bourne, around 2 miles away. But Hamilton's Bourne could only accommodate 5 coaches, so this meant that the front 5 coaches would be split away from the train by the train crew, and the driver and front guard would take those on to Hamilton's Bourne, leaving 10 coaches stood on the bank. Now, just going back to the braking system for a moment. Because of the type of braking system that the excursion train had, a non-automatic continuous brake, it would have normally have also been equipped with scotches, or sprags, as Irish railwaymen called them at the time, and these would sit and jam under the wheels to stop them rolling back. However, the rule about guards vans carrying scotches, or sprags, only applied to freight trains, and as we know, this was a passenger train. Consequently, no scotches were on the guards vans. The absence of scotches or sprags meant that the guards had to improvise, and they did this by trying to scotch the train with rocks, and had placed rocks under each of the wheels on his guards van, and also the rearmost wheels on the last passenger coach. The guard at the front of the train was responsible for splitting the front 5 coaches off. Now, the way that the carriages were coupled together was by way of a screw coupling. Now, this involves the placing of a chain over a hook, and then the coupling is wound using a handle until the buffers from each vehicle are touching. This means, obviously, especially on a hill, that when the train came to a stand, all the couplings were under a great deal of tension, and as a result, the guard wasn't able to split the train. Now, once again, our story plunges into the icy pools of improvisation here. Our front end guard scotched the first wheels of the 6th coach, and what this did was it allowed the weight to transfer from the coupling to those rocks behind the wheels, and this allowed just enough slackening of the coupler for him to undo it and allow the first 5 coaches to make their way up the bank. Once Driver McGrath was ready, he departed with those front 5 coaches, but not before they'd rolled back just enough to jolt the 6th coach with enough force for its leading wheels to overcome the rocks that had been scotching them. Now, this meant that the entire weight of 10 coaches, heavily laden with passengers, were resting on the rocks that had been placed behind the rearmost wheels by the guard and the guard's handbrake in his van. Don't forget, because the formation of the train had been broken to allow the front 5 coaches to move forward, the remainder of the train had lost its vacuum brake, and because that vacuum brake was a non-automatic brake, that meant that all the brakes on those 10 carriages had released. Gravity had its way. The guard at the very rear of the train had been stood next to the train, making sure that the scotches were in place when the wheels started to move. The weight of the train and the gradient had easily overcome those rocks and easily overcome the brake in his brake van. Now, he jumped on and tried to tighten it again with the help of some of the passengers who had been permitted to travel inside that vehicle, but it was no use. The chief clerk had run back to the guard's van and jumped on board, trying to assist in the application of the brake. Realising what was going on, he exclaimed to everyone else in the carriage, "My God, we shall all be killed!" And he then promptly jumped off. So this excursion train, packed with hundreds of people, hundreds of school children from a Sunday school, was careering downhill with no brakes, completely out of control. It was at the mercy of disaster, and disaster was just around the corner. Such was the gradient that it didn't take the detached portion of the train long to reach quite heady speeds. The Board of Trade Inspector had estimated from the damage that the train had reached speeds of 40 miles an hour or more. As that portion of the train ran further and faster out of control, the next train had departed Armagh station. You see, at the time, Irish railways didn't work using fixed signals in the way that we do today. They relied on something called time interval working. With traditional signalling, the railway is divided into geographically fixed sections that are marked by signals. A train is allowed to enter a section, but no more trains are allowed to follow it until that train leaves that section, and this ensures that trains stay separate and collisions don't occur. Time interval block or time interval working, on the other hand, relies entirely on time allowances. Now, in the case of Armagh station, one train would leave and go up the bank, and 20 minutes would elapse before the next train was allowed to leave. Now, this is regardless of where that previous train had reached, whether it had broken down, regardless of the circumstances. After 20 minutes, the next train would leave. And this is where the guard really came into their own, because in the event that a train broke down, it was the guard's responsibility to take his flags, to take his equipment, and to walk back along the track in order to warn the driver of the next train that there was danger ahead. The guard of the excursion train couldn't do that because he was clinging on for dear life in the rearmost vehicle of the train as it plunged down the hill. The driver driver of that next train sighted the rear portion of the excursion train heading his way at around 500 yards. Now, he was travelling at around 25 miles an hour. Even though he was using a similarly powered engine to the excursion train, his train was much lighter, hence he was travelling at a slightly higher speed. Now, he managed to slow the train down to around 5 miles an hour by the point of impact, but the forces at play still managed to overturn his tender and break the coupling between the tender and the first wagon. Now, that train wasn't fitted with continuous automatic brakes either. As a result, the vehicles on that train also ran away, although they were safely brought to a stand through the application of the handbrakes. Meanwhile, the rear two vehicles of the excursion train had been completely destroyed by the force of the collision. The thirdmost vehicle from the rear was also very heavily damaged. As a result, from those 940 Sunday school goers, hundreds of which were children, 80 lay dead and 260 were severely injured. Worse still for the rescuers, the wreckage had tumbled down an embankment that was 45 feet high. The Board of Trade investigation was scathing in its findings. The most heartbreaking part of this all, had the situation been dealt with correctly by those there, this collision would likely never have happened. The investigation replicated the weight and the makeup of the excursion train in a test and had found that the brakes were more than capable of holding the train on the bank. The problem and the root cause of the incident was the fact that the train's formation had been broken, and there was no need for this to happen. The Board of Trade inquiry found quite clearly that what should have been done was the guard should have been sent back to warn the driver of the subsequent train that the excursion train had stalled on the bank. That driver could then have proceeded cautiously up to the stalled train and helped push the train up the hill to Hamilton's Bourne. The General Manager's chief clerk, Mr. Elliott, came in for particular criticism from the Board of Trade. He, along with both guards of the train, the staff responsible for allocating the engine at Dundalk Depot, and the driver were all charged with culpable homicide as a result of the findings of the inquest, which took place on the 21st of June 1889. Now, the reason why Mr. Elliott was singled out was because he was a member of the management team, but not only that, he'd specifically gone against clear, laid down and established policy. The rules in force at the time were quite clear, in that no movement of such a train should be made until everybody is back on board the train after they've left it in order to carry out their duties. Now, this clearly didn't happen, because if you recall, the guard at the rear of the train was busy making sure that the wheels were secured when the wheels started to turn. Driver McGrath came in for criticism because of his overconfidence in his ability to handle the train whilst traversing such an extreme gradient, especially considering he'd never actually driven the train over that route on his own, and the fact that he'd been very vocal about raising his own displeasure with the working arrangements. The Board of Trade inspector had said that it was a shame that he'd allowed his overconfidence as a driver to overrule his better judgment in voicing his concern. With charges against all those people finalised, they were committed for trial in Dublin, which was scheduled to take place in the August. However, the guard on the rearmost portion of the train was still in hospital. The staff at Dundalk Depot were never actually charged when all came to all. And when Mr. Elliott did stand charge in August, on the first instance the jury was unable to agree on a verdict. He was then subsequently retried in October, but he was then acquitted. The dust and horror connected with the terrible events of Armagh quickly fading from the public consciousness, it was left to the channels of Parliament to try and take things forward in a bid to make sure that something like this never happened again. Had the train involved been fitted with a continuous automatic brake, as soon as its formation had been disturbed on the bank coming out of Armagh, the brakes would have applied, and they would have applied fully, because they would have required air in the system in order for the brakes to have been pushed off the wheels. As it was, the brakes in use actually worked in the opposite way. They worked on a vacuum which required the exclusion of air in order for the brakes to apply. As soon as that vacuum was destroyed and air was introduced into the system, the brakes released. This is something that the Board of Trade had been campaigning on for many years, and in the light of a series of repeated incidents, all of which had been found could have been conclusively avoided had the trains involved been fitted with a continuous automatic brake. Now, the railway companies had excuses to hide behind. They had powerful friends in Parliament, they had well-paid lobbyists. Does any of this sound familiar? But essentially their point of view in defence was that it was taking a long time to fit continuous automatic braking systems to their fleets, and it was also costing an awful lot of money. But in questions to the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, it was revealed that in the whole of Ireland there was one engine that had a continuous automatic brake capability. There were only 6 vehicles in total. In the entirety of England, 18% of the passenger rolling stock had no continuous brakes whatsoever, and a further 22 had brakes that didn't apply automatically. And in Scotland, 40% of the passenger rolling stock fleet were without any continuous brakes at all. Now, tellingly, back in 1878 there had been a very similar incident where General Hutchinson, the inspecting officer from the Board of Trade, had said unequivocally that the presence of a continuous automatic brake would have completely avoided the incident, and made a firm recommendation that this is something that needed to be legally mandated. Yet it still hadn't happened. But the weight of public opinion was beginning to get behind the push for improvements to railway safety. There was a concerted effort to try and push for a new Act of Parliament to regulate the operations of the railways, but the problem was the government of the day was already short of parliamentary time within which it could produce any more new legislation, and certainly any legislation that may have any kind of contentious aspect to it. And railway regulations certainly were contentious. The parliamentary composition of the time was quite contradictory and complicated. Plus ça change. There were quite a body of Liberal MPs who were very sympathetic to the needs of railwaymen, and they were pushing for much firmer legislation to manage the conduct of the railway companies, especially the way in which they tended to disregard what was best for safety in pursuit of what was best for profit. On the other hand, you had other Liberal MPs who were standing up and speaking against any attempt to introduce much more arduous legislation on the grounds that they felt that it was wrong for Parliament to be overly prescriptive in its directions to industry. However, public outcry at the loss of such innocent life was too much for Parliament to ignore, and around 2 months, only 2 months after the awful occurrence at Armagh, the Regulation of the Railways Act of 1899 was formally passed into UK law. Now, this revolutionary Act of Parliament authorised legally the Board of Trade to require all railway companies to require the use of automatic continuous braking on all passenger railways. It also mandated the installation of formal block-style signalling systems. So this led to the adoption of the formal absolute block signalling, upon which UK signalling systems have been built and expanded. It did, however, go further than that. Not only did it also mandate block signalling, it also mandated that all points and signals be interlocked so that conflicting routes couldn't be set by controlling signals. And this was under the doctrine known as lock, block and brake. Now, we all know that 3-word slogans haven't ended particularly well for this country of late, but this one was quite positive. And in many cases, the 1889 Regulation of the Railways Act was actually the start of modern railway safety as we've come to know it. Hey, just wanted to say thanks so much for the continuing support. Keep those suggestions coming in. Keep commenting, keep interacting with my page. I love all the interactions, love keeping in touch, and I love discussing all things railway with you. So keep up the good work. Keep letting me know all about those stories that you want me to cover. Now, in the meantime, drop me a like, drop me a follow, favourite the videos, tell your friends, share the profile. Thanks very much.